Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ambrose. I'm your host this morning. Before we begin, let me say this meeting is being recorded and will be made publicly accessible through Civic Leicester. Civic Leicester is a community media channel that uses video, photography, print and digital technologies, and social media to highlight conversations. This morning's event is part of a series that draws on the structure of the Sewell Report and facilitates a series of conversations looking at and responding to what the report says about education and training, employment, fairness at work, enterprise, crime and policing, and health. The series encourages the city to make its own recommendations around the issues raised in the report. The structure of the event this morning is that we have 4 speakers. Each of the 4 speakers will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then this will be followed by a discussion and a Q&A session. If you have questions or observations or comments that you would like to make, please put them in the chat. After the Q&A session, we'll have final words from the panel before the event closes. Initially, we had scheduled that the event would run for about an hour and a half or so. But we might stop early. We might finish early. We'd scheduled that the event would run until 1:30 p.m. But depending on how it goes, I think we will aim for to finish in about 90 minutes. Our speakers this morning, we have a Member of Parliament for Leicester East, Claudia Webbe. We also have Councillor Elaine Pantling, who is Vice Chair of the Leicestershire and Rutland Police and Crime Panel. And we have Arthur Dion Hanna, who is a Research Coordinator at the Race Equality Centre. And our 4th speaker is Priya Thamother, who is Head of the Highfields Centre and also Chair of the Leicester Civil Rights Movement. We have received apologies from Dr. Iris Wiger, who is a lecturer in sociology at the University of Loughborough, and also from Leicestershire Police Chief Constable Simon Cllr. We'd invited the new Leicester and Leicestershire Crime and Police Commissioner, but we've not had. Initially, they said they were going to look at the request, but we've not heard from them since. We go to Elaine.
Okay, hello, good morning everyone. I just want to first of all say that as we are having this meeting, I am no longer the Vice Chair of the Police and Crime Commissioner panel. I was previously last year, and I've been on the panel for a few years. So really sort of kind of from an official capacity, I cannot speak on behalf of the crime panel. But just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I am from Leicester, born in Blaby actually. I've worked in the hosiery trade for more than 20 years, went to university at the ripe old age of well, I did an access course first and in education and performance. And then I went to university, and at the age of 40, I got a degree in performing arts, and then went on to tour professionally with my one-woman shows. Since then, I've now become a counsellor. I've been a counsellor now for the ward of Ayers-Monsell for nearly 5 years now. So, and I love it. It's a really great privilege to serve the people of Ayers-Monsell. From my point of view, from the report, I've had a read of the report and looked at some of the newspaper reports around it as well. And it really has got some terrible reviews, and the response has not been brilliant. I'm looking forward to hearing what people have got to say about this and what their feelings are. And I'll be very happy to take any of your views back to Leicester City Council. Thank you. Is that okay?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elaine. And then next we hear from Dion.
Good morning. Thanks for inviting me. It's a privilege to be part of this distinguished panel, to have this very important discussion today. The Sewell Report, I don't want to curse. I don't want to use any foul language, but it is one of the most profane pieces of research that have ever flown from academia in this country, if you can call it academia. You know, what this report does is cherry pick selected data to come to a conclusion that it held before it even began its deliberations. You know, when I studied law, this back in 1970, I'm a little earlier, older than Councillor Pantling. But in 1970, when I did my law degree, there was one subject you had to pass at the University of West Indies, and that was use of English. And there was one text in that course, How to Lie with Statistics. And this is a classic example of how to lie with statistics. It is a cultural affront to the ancestors of many Black people that live in this country. It is an affront to everyday people that live in this community and throughout Britain. The report itself operates on on a culture of denial. It's almost a cancer of betrayal to the ancestors. The conclusions of the report are that young Black men are naturally criminal. That it's their poverty, their geography, and anything else but race that leads to their disproportionality in every stage of the criminal justice system. Because from the very beginning, stop and search, to the conclusion, conviction, sentencing, probation, Black people are disproportionately affected at every stage of the process. There can only be one conclusion, that there's a basis of institutional racism. But the report itself denies this. It apologizes for, and it demonizes anybody who's involved in anti-racist activity. It makes us sound as though we are loonies, you know, with chips on our shoulder. You know, the African Caribbean community is suffering from the effects of long-term problems. You know, it's a denial of the humanity. It makes Black people invisible. In respect of decolonization of the curriculum, it operates on the basis that we don't need to do that. That Black people must embrace their Britishness. But what is this Britishness? If we don't look at the historical context that written by Cllr James, Stuart Hall, Sivanandan, and many of the other writers that have exposed the historical realities of Black people in Britain. If we don't look at the work of Dr. Eric Williams, the former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, in his classic work, British Historians in the West Indies, we then don't understand the context of the discussion of who we are as a people who are British. The fact of the matter is Black people being in Britain from Roman times. So Black people are integral to this question of Britishness, but they've been excluded. This historical context is excluded in school curriculums. So if we don't decolonize it, we can't escape the conclusions that Black people are discriminated against throughout every structure, every institution that it's confronted with in the society. The most damning thing that comes out of this report that exposes its complicity in racism is the conclusion that slavery had good benefits. That one of the benefits was that it created good African British students and people. It gave us this cultural advantage. This is the argument used by British writers who defended slavery back in 200 years ago. The same arguments. Oh, look what a good slavery did for these savages. We gave them cultural integrity. You know, we gave them humanity. This could be no further from the truth. The report trivializes the slavery experience. It denies the brutality, the resistance that was inherent throughout the process. Throughout the process of colonization, there was resistance. Throughout the British struggle for Black justice, there's been resistance. From 1958 in Nottingham, Brixton, St. Paul's, Liverpool, and a host of other cities, Black young youth at the time stood up and resisted police oppression. This is historical fact. And this historical fact that is being denied by this report, it wants to eliminate that. We mustn't study that. We must forget that and accept that we are very fortunate to live in post-Brexit Britain, which is one of the best examples that can be held out to any white majority country in the world as being best in multicultural reality and non-racist agendas. This could be nothing further from the truth. The Brexit exercise exposed the undercrust of racism that runs throughout British society. British racial attacks are on the rise. Police stop and searches are 19 times more likely in the case of a young Black man than a white man, young white man. There's a whole host of disproportionality. I won't go through the statistics. I mean, data is out there. But I just would conclude with saying this. The arc of human justice, the arc of moral righteousness is our task. We can't give up to this report. This will affect how resources are given out. It will affect how the criminal justice system reacts to the young Black people that come in contact with it. It will act as a basis for xenophobes and lackeys of white right-wing doctrine to come out with their mantras and exemplify, as exemplified in media, racism, and expose us to this diatribes of nonsense that comes from the gut of xenophobia. So I just would close on this. We can't give up. We have to expose this report for what it is. We have to struggle to create a just society of equality of opportunity for all. We have to have a historical reckoning where reparations are paid for the enslavement of the African people, for the colonial exploitation, and for the policing that has been confronting Black people, not only in Britain, but throughout the colonial world, because that is the essence of British policing. It was, in terms of Black people, it's not just Britain that they act as a military incursion, a deprivation of human rights. This is not just in Britain that this happens. This was done throughout the world, the Caribbean. It was done throughout India. It was done throughout Africa. People are being reduced in their humanity. People being exposed to police brutality. This report is a shocking silence on the question of young Black men killed in police custody, or in prison custody, or in the hospitals. It denies the reality of ordinary everyday people, and we owe our future generations the process of fighting it. We can't give up the fight. You know, the struggle for justice continues. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I went over my time.
Thank you very much, Dion. Priya, how do you respond to the Sewell report? What is your response?
Thanks, Ambrose, and thanks for also inviting me to contribute to this session today. The particular report, which is something like 260 pages long, we've been asked to focus on a particular aspect of it, the crime and policing section of it. That alone is some 60 pages long, and I think it'd be useful for those attending today's session if I take you all briefly through some of the findings of that chapter. The Sewell states that one of the biggest concerns about the unfair treatment of minorities is in terms of the crime and policing experiences they have. And he says that the data consistently highlights the overrepresentation of ethnic minority groups, both as perpetrators and victims, that the police workforce diversity figures continue to remain low, and then adds that past injustices still loom large in perceptions of the police for some ethnic minority Britons, particularly Black Caribbeans. They apparently undertook fairly extensive engagement and examination of data to establish causes of the key disparities they found in crime and policing. They also commissioned new research, and they claim they built on previous reports. They cite the David Lammy report. And they go on to say they wanted to demonstrate what drives these disparities and also to propose ways of addressing those with a focus on 4 areas: re-establishing mutual trust between communities and the police, preventing harm and directing young people away from entering the criminal justice system, encouraging ethnic minority groups to work with and support police services to improve outcomes for their local communities, and improving the workforce diversity within police forces. Their findings were many, and amongst some of those key findings were that ethnic minority people, and specifically Black people, are disproportionately victims of violent crime and homicide. That Class B drug offences accounted for nearly half of all prosecutions for almost all ethnic groups. Stop and search is a critical tool for policing, and when it's used appropriately and lawfully. That they go on to say that communities are not given enough information, and that statistics have remained unexplained for too long. Nearly half of all stop and searches in England and Wales were made by the Metropolitan Police in London, and the majority of all stop and searches involving Black people were apparently made in that area too. Ethnic minority police officers are also experiencing racist abuse from citizens they serve, including from their own minority groups. No police services were fully ethnically representative of the population they serve, and they say these forces will also need to go beyond simply being representative of the ethnic minority communities they serve. They have a section on hate crime and harassment, recognizing it's a serious offense that can have long-term impacts on individual victims. They claim most reliable data shows that it may be declining, and they cite the Crime Survey of England and Wales as evidence of that alleged decline. Hate crime is also more likely to be experienced by people from ethnic minority, they say. It's not just carried out by white people, with an overrepresentation of Black people among perpetrators. Now, I found that somewhat perplexing, because in the very next sentence, they go on to say, in 2019, 80% of those proceeded against for religiously or racially motivated hate crimes were white, 9% were Black, and 7% Asian. Fear of hate crime amongst ethnic minority communities is also greater than its likelihood of experience. And finally, they say that abusing online hate crimes through social media sites is having a significant impact on victims, and they refer to some of how that's been experienced by Black MPs, etc., and sports persons. Now, the next section in this chapter is where some of what Dion was referring to really comes through, where they say that race and crime and its intersectionality has been a taboo subject for far too long. And they go on to say the society is to blame assumptions and a positive desire not to further stereotype already disadvantaged groups has created a reluctance to talk honestly about the seriously damaging criminal behavior of a small minority of people, especially in ethnically diverse communities. The Commission is well aware, they say, of criminal behavior being found in all groups, and further states that the majority of people in the country do not commit crime. Surprise, surprise. And then they claim support for their findings from David Lammy's report, and that, this reluctance to talk about the wider elements, wider factors that impact on the criminal justice system are not really discussed. So people from a Black background are more likely to live in poverty than those from a white background. Black children are more likely to grow up in lone parent families. Black and white ethnic boys are more likely than white boys to be permanently excluded from school and to be arrested as a teenager. They recognize the overrepresentation of ethnic minorities in the criminal justice system, with Black people being the most overrepresented. They go on to say Black people arrested at a rate 3 times higher than white people. In the year ending March 2020, people in Asian and other ethnic groups had the highest custody rates. And also that the figures from Ministry of Justice show overrepresentation of all ethnic minority groups among those convicted of serious crimes, such as robbery and possession of weapons. Several other findings they refer to in the chapter, including that several police services cited drugs and hard drug county lines as being the key drivers for the use of stop and search, not guns and knives. So the repeated utterances from various Home Office ministers over the last 10 years and more that this is, the increased use of stop and search is to get knives and guns off the streets is not what the police themselves say. Stop and search rates highest for Black Caribbean people, 39 stops per 1,000, Black African people, 34 per 1,000, and Asian others, 30 per 1,000. Rates for white people were 6 per 1,000. The highest percentage of arrests resulting from stop and search was of white people, 52%, followed by 19% for Black people and 9% for Asian people, equating to approximately 1 in 2 white people arrested as a result of stop and search, 1 in 5 Black people, and 1 in 10 Asian people. They return to that theme about other risk factors that draws young people particularly into violent crime. These include adverse childhood experiences such as abuse, neglect, parental criminality, substance abuse, educational attainment, that's low educational attainment, experience of victimization, and living in areas of deprivation. And to cap it all, they say long-term experiences of racism can have an effect on people, arguing that consistent experiences of racism can add to feelings of disenfranchisement and cause violence, involvement in gangs, or make crime to seem either more appealing or feel less serious. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, they then go on to say that one of their other findings being that recent research has suggested that young men's gang involvement linked to finding their place in a post-industrial context and indeed finding refuge in a racist society. They want to see more community leadership and role models to redirect young people's energies into actions that provide for progression in society. They want parents, teachers, social workers, and policymakers to better understand and address the complexities faced by young people. And they cite the Glasgow violence reduction example as something that needs to be rolled out across the country. There are various other recommendations as well on improving training to police officers with practical skills to interact with communities, promoting fairness in terms of the police interaction by introducing more body-worn video, and so on and so forth. The references, earlier references to increasing the diversity of the force, etc. So what does all of this mean for us? And I'd like to conclude with some personal reflections on policing over the last 40 plus years. We know in this country that, the post-war migration of African, Caribbean, Asian families caused all kinds of ructions in British society. Things that had been hidden for a long time suddenly became exposed, schooling being one classic example of that. And this report has led to considerable academic and activist critiques of the report's origins, the Commission's members, its government allies, its political ideologies, and also for its unscientific methodology, lack of credibility, poor argument, lack of transparency, etc., etc. Those critiques have been provided locally by TREC, and Dion would be, was involved in the report that TREC produced as a response to the Sewell Report, and nationally by the Institute of Race Relations, and a range of other people, activists, academics, others, including the British Medical Journal has critiqued the report. So we move from assimilation and multiculturalism of the 70s to the race riots and recognition of institutional racism in the 80s and 90s. The last decade has been about wishing away those realities and replacing it with another institutional culture. We had the downgrading of the race relations work to the so-called equal rights, Equalities and Human Rights Commission, and all of that has happened not just under this government, but also the predecessor government in the 2000s. Whilst the last year has brought these horrific and historically continued racial inequalities to a wider global audience, it's a comment on the British state that it can seemingly turn those realities on its head and take pride and comfort in those brutal and sometimes genocidal practices and put out a report which flies in the face of the evidence presented of ongoing racial injustices in key areas such as health, policing, and education. And indeed, they come up with positing that ethnic minorities have never had it so good. Dion referred, for example, to how Britain could be viewed as a model for post-colonial societies. My personal experience of UK policing from the days of Grunwick and anti-National Front protests in the 70s to an evening stroll by a group of my students in King's Road, Chelsea in the late 70s, when on completion of their year-long course, we took them to the Royal Court Theatre. Because we were there a bit early, the students asked, they'd heard about King's Road, they asked if they can go down for a little walk, and we said yes. Within a couple of minutes, one of the lads came running back to say the police were hassling them. I got there, and when I inquired, I was just brushed aside. When my white colleague came along, they did speak to him, and they said that, groups of black kids, youths coming down here is only to do bag snatching and mugging, and that's what they had to respond to. So that kind of experience, I don't think has changed. There's not been a fundamental change, other than now we see a few more black and brown faces within the police force. Their objectives still remain largely about controlling and subverting dissent. We have all the evidence of the camera teams and the concerted attempts to undermine and infiltrate campaigns, be it the Stephen Lawrence campaign, environmental protest, and others. As with other sections of this report, this aspect of crime and policing is equally and willfully blind to the interplay between race and class. Those are not mutually contradictory, as Sivanandan and others have rightly said over the last 50 years and more. Race and class are intertwined in terms of positing black people in the position they find themselves in. As many have said, this is just another attempt to divide and derail us, and we have to resist it every step of the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priya. Claudia, would you like to come in?
Hello. I certainly can do, and it's. I want to thank you and the organisers for inviting me to this hugely important event, and it's actually a pleasure to speak alongside, I guess, such an inspiring range of other speakers and excellent panelists. I'm very heartened that my home city has such a forceful and well-organised opposition to this damaging report. And I would like to start by saying that the inspiring Black Lives Matter protests last year, I did not see a single sign asking for yet another inquiry into racial inequalities. People of all ages and ethnicities across the country took to the streets to demand long overdue action, not yet more fact-finding. There have been, as we know, countless reviews and reports into structural racism in recent years, especially in relation to crime and policing. There were 35 recommendations in the Lammy review into criminal justice and 110 recommendations in the Angeloni review into deaths in police custody, to name just but a few. So rather than embarking on another consultation, the government really should have introduced these oven-ready recommendations. Yet instead, they've been preoccupied with creating a new narrative in which minorities are blamed for the systemic disadvantages they face. By denying the existence of institutional racism, the government's report on race and ethnic disparities was a slap in the face for Black communities, for African, Asian and minority ethnic communities, and all those affected by racism. The claim that the UK is a world-leading bastion of racial progress was nothing short of state-sanctioned gaslighting. And the patronising dismissal of young people's idealism was a disgraceful attempt to distract from the government's own failures on issues of equality. The fact that the report even tried to put a positive spin on the legacy of slavery demonstrates how utterly unserious the government is about addressing racial inequality. The government was working backwards from a preconceived conclusion that institutional racism does not exist. Indeed, Boris Johnson's most senior Black advisor, Samuel Kasumu, resigned just days after the report, after accusing the government of pursuing a politics steeped in division. The report also failed to incorporate the views of the public. The government admitted that thousands of individuals and organisations who responded to the consultation used terms such as systemic, systematic, structural, institutional, internalised, inherent, and cultural racism to describe what they considered to be the cause of ethnic disparities. This proves the falsehood of the government's claim that there is no evidence of institutional racism, as to find such evidence, they would only have had to look at their own consultation. So the government cannot wish away the reality of structural discrimination. In the UK, the brutality of institutional racism affects us in all walks of life, from police use of force to the disproportionate number of Black children who go to bed hungry. Discrimination is deeply ingrained in our social, political and economic structures. It results in unequal access to quality education, healthy food, livable wages and affordable housing, which are the foundations of health and well-being. The report displayed an appalling ignorance of institutional racism in the criminal justice system. We know that Black people disproportionately suffer from police use of force in the UK, are more likely to be charged and are overrepresented in the prison population. Here in Leicester, a Black person is 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white person. In the youth custodial estate, the proportion of African, Caribbean, Asian and minority ethnic children is 52%, despite being 18% of the 10 to 17-year-old population. The government must drop its pathetic, counterproductive crusade against institutional racism and outline a target-driven plan to end the shocking racial disparities in the criminal justice system. The reports claim that socio-economic factors, not institutional racism, are to blame for severe racial disparities is bitterly ironic. It is true that class and race intersect in a pernicious way. Yet this government of the super rich has normalized poverty in our communities and overseen an upwards transfer of wealth and power that has enriched the few at the expense of the many. For them to produce a report that preaches the predominance of class issues over racism is beyond parody. There is a litany of urgent actions that the government could take to show that they are taking this issue seriously. For example, it could implement the recommendations from the existing reviews. It could reform the UK's racist criminal justice system. It could deliver justice for the victims of racialized state violence, including Grenfell Tower and the Windrush generation. The government must ensure that when a Black person dies in police custody, as they disproportionately do, the incident is thoroughly investigated and the police involved face justice. It must transform our education system to teach, yes, teach the reality of colonialism and imperialism. And when I talk about ensuring that the government must transform our education system to teach the reality of colonialism and imperialism, we shouldn't obviously forget the transatlantic slave trade, but it must also address the severe racial pay gap as well. It must end racist policies like no recourse to public funds and the hostile environment. Accepting that these are structural problems will be the first step in this process. The report is simply the latest pathetic public relations stunt in the government's divisive culture wars. We saw another chapter this week with the publication of a report that blames the phrase white privilege for educational discrepancies, rather than the sustained and severe cuts to education and support for young people undertaken by the Conservatives over the last 10 years. They shut youth clubs up and down this country. They withdrew the educational maintenance allowance. There were so many things that the Conservative government did to undermine equality in terms of our education system and ensure that all working class children had the support that they needed. The government's aim to individualize racism and to claim that discrimination is no longer a societal issue is the expression of the Thatcherite dogma that there is no such thing as society. So the government's attempts are little short of gaslighting. Yet this is a crisis that requires collective solutions. That is the mission that faces all of us today, to reject this government's attempts to divide us up and to fight, yes, fight together for a world free of racial and class inequalities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you very much. When I was reading when I was also going through what the report says about crime and policing, that it came out that the view that I got is that actually the people who produced the report, what they want to do is they want to defend the police. They are blaming communities for the violence that is happening in their communities. And they are also saying, you know, these are problems for those communities to solve. What do you think a place like Leicester should say to the Sewell Report and also to government? This is a question for panelists.
Okay. From my point of view, from being a ward councillor in Esmonsall, I was speaking to a police officer a couple of weeks ago about community engagement. And I know you've just asked this question, but I've got to go soon. I have to say, I really apologise for that. And she was saying, we talked about how many people she knew on the estate. And one of the things that she said was that, of course, I do know a lot of people on the estate, councillor, but they're mainly people that are involved in crime. And she said that one of the things that she really felt as a police officer was that she wanted to have more communication with all the people in the community. And because she said that trust for her was a really important factor, you know, on getting the community alongside the work that they're doing as officers. And you could feel her frustration around that. And I think that, you know, if we want to send a message, well, we have to send a message back to this government that the 10 years of austerity that they have put onto our communities, destroying our youth work, destroying our community work, you know, taking funds away from our councils, you know, this has really had a diverse impact on all people, and on the people that are trying to serve us in our communities too. And I think that, you know, they talk about giving us more money, but it's all talk, and we want action. We want to see this happening. We want to see our youth centres opening again. You know, they talk about prevention, and prevention is a key. Prevention, education, they're all key issues that need to be dealt with, but they're just being talked about, and that's not enough. And if we are going to look back, looking back needs to help us to look forward, you know, and I think that is really, really crucial. And you know, we talk about colonialism, all of those things. We talk about class and race, and where I serve in Esmonsall, there is a lot of people there that are living below the poverty line. We talk about working class, but there's a different class of people that are beneath that, that are living in adverse poverty, and they're the things that we need to really deal with. And you know, it really, really saddens me when I hear all of this stuff that all the speakers have spoken about race and how the racism is growing. And I think that is true. It is. And Brexit has really not helped that at all. You know, Brexit is not nationalism. Actually, I think is a poisonous chalice. It can be a poisonous chalice, and it's really, we need to be very careful about that. And all this stuff about travel, everything that's going on right now, I think really absolutely it really does enforce that whole thing about racism and gets people to think badly about each other. I think this government, they're just atrocious, really. I think that that's all I'm going to say about it. I really care about the people I serve, and I want the right thing for them. And I think the right thing for our country is, you know, we need to look forward. And this report, as you say, is quite, it's just what Claudia said about, you know, this gaslighting government. I think she's absolutely right, and it's that there's a lot of showboating going on too. and we want some real action if we're going to have a better future for our young people to live together in harmony. So, but thank you very much for asking me to be on it, but I do have to go and deal with something very important in the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elaine. Priya, did you want, oh, Claudia or Priya, one of you wanted to say something.
Well, just in response to your challenge there, or your question in relation to what does it mean for communities, I guess, is what you're saying. I mean, at the end of the day, in the context of crime, we know that crime thrives amid poverty and a lack of opportunity, has just been outlined. And over 1 in 4, that's 42%, or 1 in 2 rather, almost 1 in 2, 42% of children in Leicester East actually live in poverty. Now that's an appalling set of statistics, and that will mirror itself across Leicester. Almost 1 in 2 are living in poverty. And nearly 6,000 households, around 14% in Leicester East, are in fuel poverty. The average weekly income for full-time employees in Leicester is £130 less per week than the East Midlands average as a whole, and £160 less than the UK average. And you will know that I've spoken loud and clearly about some of the issues that are affecting our communities. To say that the police only know communities when a crime is being committed, well, what about recognising Black communities, African, Asian, minority ethnic communities as victims? Surely that is that recognition of communities as victims. And it is absolute robbery that workers are working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, and yet are earning poverty wages. That is a crime. Understanding those issues that affect our communities ought to be some of the things that the police should concern themselves with. The government has starved local government and local authorities of funding, as has been outlined just now, over the last 10 years, creating an environment in which violence can grow unchecked. In Leicester, central government grant funding has been cut from 289 million in 2010 to 171 million in 2019. That is a gross theft from our communities. This means essentially frontline services, especially services that speak to young people, and detached youth provisions, for example, and outreach programs suffer as a result. And therefore, we have a minority of young people that will fall through the net. It's not like the days when I grew up in Leicester, where you had provisions which related to building-based youth provision, provisions that related to issue-based youth work, and provisions that related to detached youth work, recognizing it's young people that choose where they go, what they do after school time. And so without those kinds of provisions, a minority of young people who are missing that safety net may turn to a life of crime, or rather they will be consumed by the criminal on the street who will want to consume them because they're vulnerable. And therefore they lack opportunities. And we're talking about a minority of young people, but it's a minority nonetheless that is impactful, where the other majority of young people are having to navigate their way around the streets to avoid danger and avoid crime points where they will be lured into a different reality. So they do not have opportunities or a realistic hope for a better future, and only a large-scale investment, in my view, in our communities will end this cycle of misery. And in a sense, it's all of that which creates a situation where communities aren't being supported, don't have the necessary input to where they, you know, Black communities in Leicester still feel over-policed as criminals and under-policed as victims. That is a damning position to be in, and the police have a job to do to overcome that. But we say that in the context that the police service itself has also been cut in terms of its funding as well. Should we feel sorry for them in that regard? But the reality is, taking away those resources means there is less funding for the police to do the sorts of things that it was doing when I was growing up as a child in Leicester, i.e. involving itself in the community, organising events and working with a whole range of voluntary community organisations to put on events and activities that we can all enjoy, i.e. they were community police officers in the traditional sense. I'm not saying that we didn't have our problems, because 81 existed, 1981 existed, 85 existed, and so on. But certainly there was a great deal more community, neighbourhood policing than we're seeing today. Thank you.
Yes, Priya, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think, you know, this is fundamental to what we face here in Leicester. I mean, there's been reference to the gaslighting on the national stage. It seems to me that is not dissimilar in many ways from what's been happening locally over the last couple of decades.
That is all about Leicester. Everything that's said is all about Leicester.
Right. I'm making reference here to, you know, the fact that in this area of Leicester, Highfields, which has one of the highest incidents of deprivation, disadvantage, and predominantly racially minoritized communities, we do not have a single local authority funded youth session here. Now you compare that with 2004, we used to have, just at this center, 30 sessions a week, both in-house and out on the streets. That's not taking into account the additional youth work sessions that were being conducted at Wesley Hall, Moe Community College, African Caribbean Center, etc. So that's the level of what's happened here in Leicester over these last 15 plus years. We don't have a single social welfare advice session provided in this area of Leicester. Yet we have millions spent on various projects, capital projects, ostensibly with this trickle-down benefit to Leicester citizens that hasn't been realized for those citizens. No more. I mean, that's been wholly discredited nationally, but here in Leicester, we seem to be pursuing those kinds of routes. So we have that on the one hand from the local authority. We have from the police a complete denial of institutional racism within their force. The event that TREC organized a few weeks ago, we had the then PCC saying absolutely not, that the Leicestershire police were absolutely not institutionally racist. And that was a view supported by an ACC, an Assistant Chief Constable, who was on that panel as well. So that's a level of what we have to come up against here in the city. And we also have, you know, from time to time in disadvantaged communities, things go awry. And then we have the whole kind of hard policing response, the helicopters, the wagons, and so on and so forth. No expense spared. Yet when we talk about, well, how does that deal with issues of those young people on an ongoing basis, we get thrown a token £6,000. And yes, it's helpful. We use that money to engage a couple of youth workers to go out there and make contact with those young people, bring them into the centre, involved in some arts and sports work, and the level of disturbances dies down, and then everyone walks away. The police walk away, the local authority walks away because the problem's been solved. Now, I think that's the kind of malpractice we would like to get addressed, and hopefully, you know, with Claudia now on the scene, hopefully we can actually begin to pose those questions in a more strategic manner and get some resolution, rather than, as we've had to end up doing for the last 5 years, our youth work is funded through BBC Children in Need. If somebody had said to me 15, 20 years ago, Priya, in terms of doing youth work in the Highfields area, you're going to have to put out a begging bowl to, you know, those kinds of funding bodies, I would have said, no way. These are strategic priorities and should be funded accordingly. But that's the reality we're in here now in Leicester in 2021.
And Dion, what would your response be?
Well, I was at that conference with Priya, and it was really disheartening to hear the PCC and the ACC with their persistent denial of institutional racism. And despite evidence being thrust on them, there was a severe cognitive dissonance and historical amnesia on their part. And so in terms of the state, the local police and the role, the future of young Black men in the criminal justice system, I think things will continue as they are unless we confront it. I think what I would like to see is that there should be a united response, and as Claudia mentioned, and the response should be to the government to reject this Sewell report. It's a bogus report. It's bogus academia and it's bogus conclusions. And we need to have it rejected. We need to call on the government to come up with a more acceptable panel that doesn't have people with preconceived notions. Sewell has a history of denial of institutional racism. The person that appointed Sewell has a history of denial of institutional racism. And the prime minister that sits on the top of the pile, who talks about pickaninnies and Muslim women wearing letterbox, looking like letterboxes. This man sits on top of this whole thing, and he calls back. If you listen to him in Parliament, he reminisces how much better the colonies would have been if Britain still controlled them. He's actually said things like this. So we need a revolution. We need to change the government. You know, first of all, we need to get rid of these jokers, but we need them to reject this report. This report has been condemned by the United Nations organizations, have come out and condemned it. We've roundly condemned it. We need some social justice in our community. And what we need is a reevaluation of our historical context. For too long, on the issue of race, there's been a severe historical amnesia that Stuart Hall talks about. The failure to come to terms with British role in the institution of slavery itself. This disconnect. The people don't want to know. It's too painful for them to bear, to acknowledge how complicit they have been in the whole concept of racism. Race was invented in the 19th century to justify colonial exploitation of the African and Caribbean and Asian peoples. And we need an acknowledgement of that. We don't need historical revisionism to say how good it was for Black people and Africans to come across the institution of slavery so they could become good Black British citizens. We need to end that nonsensical discourse. And what we really need is acknowledgement of the truth. There's a whole wealth that was built in this country on the back of slavery. Hilary Beckles eloquently exposes from the highest level, the royal family, the prime minister, the former prime ministers, and their connection to slavery. And there's companies like Barclays Bank, Lloyd's, all of these institutions have reaped immense wealth from the institution of slavery. There's a lot of suffering and blood, sweat, and tears because at no stage of slavery, Dr. Henry Clark makes reference to this. At no period during slavery was the acceptance of slavery by the enslaved people. There's a history of resistance to slavery from the earliest of times, from 1723, when in the Bahamas, Quirino rose up to strike down his oppressors. And even though eventually many of these uprisings failed, in Haiti, the Saint-Domingue Revolution that created the end of slavery in Haiti, that defeated the French, that defeated the British, that defeated the Spanish. This was the voice of resistance to oppression. And we have a history of resistance to oppression in this country that we have to continue. And that would be my message to this community. I mean, we need to unite to resist oppression. The same resistance that took place in 1958 in Nottingham, in 1981 in St. Paul's in Brixton, and when throughout all uprisings when Black people could take no more, we need that spirit of resistance. We have to fight down oppression. Then I think my brother, the poet, oh Lord, when the fascists attack, we counterattack. Priya, you know, I mean.
Linton?
Yeah, Crazy Linton. When the fascists attack, we counterattack. When the race deniers attack, the anti-racists expose the truth. We counterattack. And we have to be as eloquent as we can be to denounce nonsense, because that is what the Sewell Report is. And I think in terms of the local situation, we can't give up on the police and the police commissioner. It's unfortunate that your current police commissioner didn't have the courtesy to respond to you, because it's a really, in these telling times, it's really almost a betrayal for him not to be part of this discussion. He may have a legitimate reason, but because he hasn't responded to you in any way, I think that speaks volumes. And I would like to have heard what he would have had to say, because the former police and crime commissioner, with all due respect to him, was in total denial. While acknowledging white privilege, he denies institutional racism. But when white privilege and institutional racism go hand in hand, you know, white privilege is the handmaiden of institutional racism. And he was in total denial, and he almost to the point when confronted that he took offense. You know, but I think this is what we confront. We can't give up on them, and we must, like Claudia says, we must build on the volume of work that's been done before the Sewell Report. You know, the Antononi findings in respect of death in custody, the McPherson Report, where for the first time, the police acknowledged their institutional racism. I mean, if we place this in a historical context, McPherson was the first time in over 50 years where the police had been denying constantly the existence of racism in the force. That the first time that there was an acknowledgement. And now we've come full circle, some 20 years, short years after the McPherson Report, And after the findings of the Lamy report, it exposed the reality of the criminal justice system and young Black people. And so we come full cycle. We need to move forward now. We need to get rid of the cloud of Sewell. Sewell, I think we should reject and put him on the dustbin of history as a reject, as a betrayal. And that's what his report is. It's a cancer of betrayal. You know, when Kwame Nkrumah was being with his funeral, Amilcar Cabral made an eloquent speech talking about how he had been betrayed by those who had tried to depose him. And that is what we have here. We have a cancer of betrayal by people who want to sing for their supper, sycophants of this government, who sing the mantra of racism that is inherent and not racism. That's my 10 cents.
Thank you, Dion. And also going back to the report, one of the things that comes across is that Class B drugs, possession or use or dealing Class B drugs is used to justify stop and search, the use of stop and search. And we wish elsewhere there are statistics which suggest that Black people are no more likely to use cannabis, for example, than white people, and yet they are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched, and there are 50% more. There are 50% more prosecutions for Class B related offences than for anything else. What should happen with Class B drugs, and what position should Leicester take on the issue? This is for all of you.
I think personally, I think it's a non-argument to talk about drugs without context in this way, because we know why Black people are disproportionately stopped and searched. The reality is they're stopped and searched because they are Black. There is no other rationale or reason why this happens. And so we shouldn't play into those false narratives that try to find a rationale reason. There isn't any statistics that can tell us that Black people have a propensity to commit a certain type of crime greater than any other community. That is a false narrative. And so we shouldn't really play into that argument. The reality is that whether you're walking or whilst Black, or driving whilst Black, or even breathing whilst Black, you are likely to come into the attention of the police services, both in Leicester and elsewhere. That is the reality of our life as Black people in this country. It is a stark fact that existed in Leicester when I was a child, and it's still going on generationally to this day. It's just that in times gone by, you had support systems as been described. You had support systems and mechanisms in place, such as clear youth provisions, clear activities, after school clubs, Saturday provisions, detached youth work provisions, all manner of things to help and support the young person that was being engaged with by the police in a disadvantaged and disproportionate way. And all that investment has been stolen from young people in Leicester over time. And so they didn't experience what I experienced at Moat Community College, for example, and they didn't experience what I experienced in terms of the kinds of early intervention that I had to an awakening around race and to an understanding around race, because I had access to the resources and support that wasn't otherwise provided in state education, or by other institutions. That was called community action and intervention to support our young people who were inevitably facing racism. You have to understand that I went to school at a time in Leicester when, you know, as African, Caribbean and Asian young people, we were getting pelleted on the streets just walking to school. Stones would be put into snowballs and thrown and directed at us. Name calling was the norm. And this is the reality that we've come out of. The fact that we have no resources and investment to tackle that problem is a crying shame. So part of the resources included issue-based youth work, and that meant, for example, that you're working on issues that affect a minority of young people who are vulnerable to certain negatives that are in our that beset neighbourhoods and communities, such as alcoholism, or such as a propensity to take drugs. So the key issue is that how do you protect young people from these dangers? And without the investment and resources, there isn't a way to protect all young people. And it is about treating this issue as something that affects all young people, not a particular ethnicity or group of young people, or particular ethnic grouping. So the reality is what we do is we buy into the narrative, the false narrative that the Sewell Report wants to present, and therefore misdirect our conversations in the wrong way. We should not necessarily be having a conversation about the way in which somehow that Black people are responsible for their own victimization and discrimination by the police. They're not. The reality is that the policing service and the criminal justice system that they experience are disproportionately weighted against Black communities. We know that in when we look at annual population surveys, for example, we know that around, in totality, if you look at the whole of the UK, around 16% of the general population were from an African, Asian and minority ethnic background, but they made up 23% of people arrested, 21% of people convicted of a crime, and 27% of people in prison. 37% in 2019 were people from African, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds who fared badly in the court system, more likely to be in prison than their white counterparts, where a conviction is given. And all of this is laid bare in the Lammy report. So why we're going backwards and to argue a false narrative is beyond me. So we know that there are longer average custodial sentence lengths being handed down to African, Asian and minority ethnic communities and Black people in particular. And the average, we know that these disparities are stark, and we know that the disparities continue to exist to this day. And notwithstanding the fact that, you know, we have a situation where in my own constituency of Leicester East, I'm spending a significant amount of time, you know, trying to get people out of unfair detentions. Unfair detentions, you know, people are being imprisoned for committing no crime, essentially. And during a pandemic where the planes aren't going anywhere anyway. So there was this discrimination going on left, right and centre in all manners of ways. And we have to be careful not to get ourselves caught up in the arguments and narratives, which are false arguments and narratives, to justify why Black people are disproportionately disadvantaged in the criminal justice system and in their relationships with the police. That's the wake-up call we have to remind ourselves of, and you know, we have to continue to reject the Sewell report. In a way, us having this conversation today about it just gives oxygen to it. It is a report that we need to reject and condemn wholeheartedly. As has already been said, the UN has already condemned it and rejected it. We should do so too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Priya and Dion, do you want to come in?
I mean, I'd wholeheartedly support what Claudia has been saying in terms of this report and paying too much attention to it. But clearly, this is what the government is trying to thrust on us, and you know, the subsequent reference to white privilege being a term that's not to be pursued and taken for further consideration within schooling, etc. I guess my response in terms of the usage and abuse of drugs by young people, white, black, or otherwise, is also about locating it within the concrete realities of their lives. We have a situation where youth unemployment is really high and it's projected to increase quite rapidly. And if in terms of the kind of opportunities for those young people to move on, those kinds of possibilities are closed off, then they have to find ways of surviving. We had a program here, a nationally funded, lottery funded talent match program, and it was about working with what they termed hard to reach young people. There were 15 such programs nationally, and the program here in Leicester, we had the highest engagement of young black people, that's including African, Caribbean, and Asian people, anywhere of those 15 programs. And so the funders, the lottery, the government departments, Department for Culture, Media Studies Department, for Education Department for Work and Pensions, they came up to receive a presentation about what it was. Where did we find these people? Have we imported them from somewhere else? You know, and the reality is that these are that's happening out there. These are the consequences of public services being decimated. You know, I made reference to the complete absence of any publicly funded youth work sessions here in this area. So if that's a situation, we need to be more strategic about challenging government, both nationally and locally, to make good that need. You know, coming out of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, people have also quite rightly posited the situation of what could happen if racism had been seen in that same way. You know, we're told that there's no monies for these services, but we found over the last 15 months, billions of monies coming forward and being given out to certain companies and businesses. You know, this is not just a odd magic money tree. It's a whole forest of money trees that they found. So this excuse nationally and locally that there is no money is not something we can continue with, and we need to come together to make sure that those services are provided so that young people do have the possibility for moving on in ways that are constructive, helpful, and cooperational. That's what they tend towards, but sometimes they're forced to have to adopt other means to survive. And we have to get back to offering, you know, the kinds of opportunities that Claudia was referring to when she was growing up, whether both within schools and also outside of school locations.
Dion, do you want to?
Just a few words on that. I just want to agree with what both Priya and Claudia have said. I mean, it's not that we have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of projects that the government have defunded. There's a severe shortage of funding for local government and so for local services. And we see the reality of that. And I think if this society is ever to move forward and to create a truly just society based on equality of opportunity and a non-racial society, racist society, then we need to begin to fund in our young people. We need to value the human resource. The greatest resource of any country is its people. And there's a whole host of talented young Black and ethnic minority, Asian and other ethnic minority group and young people who are very talented, who can contribute a lot to the development of this country, who can make the economy much better than it is. Because if you have participation of more people in the economy will grow. The more people that are marginalized by the economy becomes stifled because it doesn't progress. It puts wealth in the hands of a few. And that's sadly what this government has done. Priya referred to the pandemic and funding in the pandemic. And what has been the fun thing, the obscene tragedy in the funding for this pandemic is that it puts millions and billions of pounds in the hands of friends and people who have associations with the government or members of the government. So, we need less concentration of wealth in the pockets of the few, and we need to make sure that resources are more readily available to the majority of people, because it's only when young people are included in the society that they will value what is in the society and help to build it. If you marginalize young Black people, and my former friend, he passed away a few years ago, Professor Felix Pantling, he always wrote his articles in Bahamas and referred to young people haven't eaten sour grapes and their teeth are on edge. And if you exclude young people, you put their teeth on edge, you make them antisocial, you create an underclass. And what this report does is fail to come to terms with how we can re-employ resources into young people. It's saying that the problem is the young people, but it's not saying how we can improve the situation for young people. And this is part of the dilemma. The report is really just a public relations exercise. This government really doesn't intend to put more resources where they really need to be given. There's no resource out there for young people programs that Claudia talks about when she was growing up. We need to reinvest in the community. And sadly, with this culture of denial and the cognitive dissonance that is evident in this report and in the policy of this government, we're not going to move forward. I think realistically, as with Thatcher, you have to get rid of the old witch before we can move on. When Thatcher died, I didn't grieve. I sang the song from Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, "Ding dong, the wicked witch is dead," because she was oppressive. She brought injustice in this community, and her legacy remains in this government. And once this government is gone, and I don't know if I hold much hope for the Labour government, because unlike Jeremy, this prime minister, this leader of the opposition you have, doesn't seem to have the foresight that Jeremy had. So I don't really hold out much hope for much change. I think we need more people like Claudia. We need conscious minds. We need people who are determined to transform the society, to make a classless society, to end privilege, to bring more social justice to the society. And we need advocates for justice. And I think that is the way forward. We need to bring a new generation of young revolutionaries who will forge the path to social justice in Britain. It takes a revolution really to make a solution. That's my 10 cents.
Thank you, Dion. So maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions and then stop, because otherwise, and then reconvene maybe next month to look at other aspects of the report. Is there anyone who has got a question?
Like, what is the actual sort of council response to the report? So what has been like the sort of political response within sort of Leicester? And yeah, that's all I was wondering.
And maybe our third question or comment can come from Charlotte. Charlotte, do you want to come in?
Hi, thank you, Ambrose. Ambrose very kindly said that I could introduce myself very quickly today, but I won't take up too much time. I'm a master's student at SOAS University in London, doing migration and diaspora studies. And for my dissertation, I wanted to do a thorough analysis of the Sewell Report through, for those who know, what we call a radical intersectional feminist lens, to understand the discourse of the report, the language that it is using, and also to understand its effects on grassroots activist communities and the political landscape that people have been experiencing in UK race relations for the past 2 decades. I think it's so important, as the panel have much more eloquently than I can put myself, that this report is analysed, because it is a deeply racist, disturbing, and in my view, colonial report that must be properly challenged and looked at in detail, particularly language-wise, because, as many people have said, one of the most disturbing things is its ability to change the narrative on racism in the UK and to argue for a post-racial society, which is, quite frankly, ridiculous and deeply offensive, and also to understand on a much more grassroots level what this means emotionally and practically for the anti-racist movement, which I believe it has been directly attacked consistently throughout this report. I'm speaking to activists and organizations, human rights and anti-racist organizations, about this report, and I would be really grateful if anyone was interested in speaking to me about this from their experience, from their communities, and about the effects that this report and the government's decade of austerity and racist behaviour has had on their work. If you would be interested in speaking to me, please do drop me a message in the chat box with your email, and I will contact you. And I would be so grateful for anyone's time, but what I know is a very stressful period for everyone. Thank you.
And also, maybe you could also put your email in the chat for people who want to get in touch with you.
Yes, of course.
Is there anyone else who wants to say something before we go back to the panelists? All right, if no one wants to speak, we go back to the panelists. We start with Claudia, and then, or we do it the other way around. We start with Priya, and then Dion, and end with Claudia.
You want us to just wrap up now, or?
I don't know. What do you say? What do you suggest?
Do you want us to do our closing comments?
Yeah, I thought that's what we could do, but we start the other way around. We start with either
Sure.
Dion or Priya, and then finish with you, if it's okay with you.
Yeah, fine. That's okay with me. I'll go first, unless Dion, you want to do that. Okay. Well, I think over these last 90+ minutes, we've come to a fairly good understanding and appreciation of the origins of the Sewell Report, its findings, and why it needs resisting and indeed get things back on track. The report itself has been condemned by a wide range of people, not all of them, you know, political activists, academics, professionals from the medical service, etc. We've had people like, you know, Doreen Lawrence, Lady Lawrence, warning that it risks pushing the fight against racism back 20 years, you know, pre-Macpherson times. And as others have said, you know, the report's contradictions and claims have been denied by people who are cited in the report. So whilst it was a really powerful opportunity based on the pulling together of the racial disparity audit that Theresa May had put together, this whole exercise has been about denying the realities that the pandemic of racism that's been in existence for not decades, but centuries. And it's taking us off in directions that are not going to be very helpful. It lacks teeth in terms of its recommendations, and it posits lots of individual discretionary actions. What we need is quite robust action on inequalities, particularly racial inequalities and institutional racism. And ultimately, we have to see this report as yet another attempt to divide and derail us. And we've got to fully resist it. Now, in terms of the point that Jackie was making, and yes, things are sometimes slow to take off, but if we can use our own connections and linkages to promote that petition, I'm sure we can get sufficient numbers to merit a parliamentary debate. It's going to be difficult given the majority the Conservatives have currently in Parliament, but I think at all levels we need to be looking to get that behind us so that we can get back to the realities of disadvantage, tackling deep-rooted inequalities and putting together programs to address that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Priya. Dion?
Hi. Yeah, I would just say that it's one of my biggest disappointments is that in the wake of the revelations about the toxic, hostile environment that African Caribbean people have been subjected to in the Windrush scandal, in the face of the Grenfell tragedy, we have this report which glosses over these issues. It fails to adequately come to terms with the lived realities, because at the end of the day, racism is experienced in the ordinary, everyday lived experiences of ordinary, everyday people. And you can't interrogate racism unless you have this discourse with ordinary, everyday people. As Claudia says, these people were not consulted in this exercise. It's not a voice of the people, it's the voice of a few sycophants. The whole issue of the Black Lives Matter has been, there was an attempt to dismiss the noble aspirations of those who threw down statues of former colonial slave masters, of people involved in the slave trade, with a casual acceptance of slavery as something that was beneficial to Black people. So we have to take this report in its historical context. It was never intended to create any constructive. We couldn't have expected anything different, given the makeup of the panel. The people who are deniers of institutional racism long before the report was even conceived. So we couldn't expect anything better. And from this government, I don't think we can expect anything better. We have a government that attitude is really to deport people who have a right to be here, to deny people who right to access to health services, to deny them access to health services, to make people invisible. And that's what this report does. It attempts to make Black people's presence in this country invisible, because if you don't decolonialize the curriculum and begin to teach the real history of the experiences of Black people in this country, the fact that Black people have been present here from Tudor times, from Roman times, and there's always been a Black presence here. So it's not just the Windrush generation that created the situation by their presence. Black people have been suffering for 500 years. There's nothing new. The concept of race was used to exploit us, and we continue to be exploited as collectively as a people. So I think, I keep harping on it. We need a revolution. And I mean that seriously. I'm a child of the 60s. I came up under Malcolm X. I came up under Che Guevara. I came up under Kwame Nkrumah. And they still beat in my heart. So I believe in a revolutionary solution. I think that the sad state of political affairs in this country for both the government and the opposition is not something that we must just become disenfranchised, discouraged by. I think this calls for greater revolutionary effort. And I'm getting old now, but I have confidence in young people. I think, oh my Lord, you gotta forgive me, this is a senior moment. Mummy Abu Jamal, in one of his texts, talks about this current generation. And he says that, we have to realize that this is one of the most conscious set of young people that we've ever had. They're really hip. They're aware of all the circumstances. He says that the current leadership we have, Black leadership, is like, those fellas used to dress up in costumes or Black faces, the minstrels that were racist images that portray the Black people. And this is the type of leadership we have portrayed within the African community, within the Caribbean communities as well. And that what we need is to give voice to these young people, to have faith in them, to empower them. The youth services that Priya swings for is part of that empowerment. And we need to give them a voice because they are the instruments of change. Our generations, then I'm the older generation here, but the younger generations like Claudia and Priya, you guys, we have failed them. We failed to make a just society. And I think that the future, our whole future, is bound up in these young people that are being demonized by this report. I think we need to empower them and to make them the authors of their own liberation. Because when they liberate themselves, they liberate us, all of us. And I think I would just close on that. It takes a revolution to create a revolution. And the arc of moral authority always curves towards social justice. So that's one thing we have to be conscious of in our resolve to make things different in this community, to make a just society for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dion. Claudia?
Thank you for that. And it's a real, I just want to just end really by saying that this has been a really insightful session. And thank you to all of the excellent speakers that shared this panel with me. I just want to finish really by taking a step back and considering the context in which this truly damaging report was produced. This project really was doomed from its inception, from its conception, really, in which the government's bad faith approach was abundantly clear. The commission itself was set up by number 10, by actually number 10's own advisor, Munira Mirza, who was repeatedly cast doubt on the existence of institutional racism. If you look back on her works are based on casting doubt on the existence of institutional racism and condemned previous inquiries for fostering, as she put it, a culture of grievance. She was also one of the few people to attack the 2016 Lamy review into inequalities in our criminal justice system. And likewise, the report's own chair, Tony Sewell, chair of the commission, has long expressed skepticism about the existence of institutional racism and argued that it creates a victim narrative to cover personal failures. Imagine. So this is significant as it speaks to the broader project of this government, which is really to distract from the rampant racial and class inequalities that their policies have exacerbated with a trumped up culture war that is designed really to stoke up the flames of division. So after the inspiring Black Lives Matter protests, it has never been more important for us to learn from the history of racial oppression and to end the injustices that exist to this day. Yet at this historical moment, the government is instead pretending, yes, pretending that racism is an individual failing, not a systemic experience, which is driven by powerful institutions. And as much of the Black Lives Matter protests originated in America, it is crucial that we in the UK do not assume, of course, that our institutions are immune from state-sanctioned racialized violence. The fact that our own government does not recognize that racism still exists in Britain today demonstrates the need for peaceful action. So when we talk about a revolution, we are talking about a revolution based on peace. The fact that an overtly racist individual such as Boris Johnson can ascend to the nation's highest office reveals the corrosive legacy of discrimination within the British establishment. Sadly, our criminal justice system is not immune from this contamination. So as in America, it appears that police in the UK can indeed act with impunity, as they have very rarely faced criminal prosecutions. So that's why the actions this week, and it was just this week, is important, because there had been no successful prosecutions for deaths in police custody since 1969. Not a single police officer has been convicted for their role in the death of a detainee, despite often compelling and incriminating evidence. So according to figures from the Independent Office for Police Conduct of deaths in custody over the last 10 years, Black people are twice as likely to die than the general population demographics would indicate. Inquest, for those that know that organisation, found that between 1990 and 2017, 184 people of African, of Asian, of minority ethnic backgrounds died in police custody. The fact that Black people, and Black men in particular, are disproportionately likely to die as a result of police use of force or restraint raises serious questions of institutional racism as a contributory factor to what is really happening in terms of deaths. What happened to, and I say all of this because we have to reflect on what happened to Dalian, who the prosecution 5 years ago, he died in police custody, and the prosecution have come to a finding only just this week. It's really important that we look at what happened in that case. It was an outcome of manslaughter. The case in terms of convictions is still ongoing. The fact that it wasn't murder we may question that. But the reality is, it is a significant marker for what we've had in the past. This is why I'm also very concerned by the government's police crime sentencing and courts bill that frankly would not look out of place within the world's most authoritarian regimes. The bill gives even more powers to police and for them to be able to crack down on peaceful protests. Now, when I was proud to stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter protests, and I say this as a parliamentarian because our role as parliamentarians is not just to sit in parliament, I believe, but our role is to be on the side, listening to communities and standing on the front line in protests. Whether it's protests, whether it's the picket line, our role as parliamentarians is to listen and be on the front line with communities. And I will continue to support all those across the world who are safely and peacefully protesting systems of racist oppression. Organised peaceful resistance is a force for change and is deserving of our full support. Much of the historic gains we have made, from the women's rights to racial inequality and improved working conditions, were not handed down from above, but fought for by generations of mass struggle. There are grave concerns that the legislation, the bill, will have a disproportionate impact on Black communities. Human rights group Liberty anticipates the impact of the bill to be felt particularly acutely by marginalised communities. Liberty has also expressed concerns about the proposal to establish a stop and search power specifically targeted at protesters. So you're right, Jacqueline, to question the impact of the report being seeped into legislation, running legislations now, because this is one such example. Because this power to establish a stop and search power specifically targeted at protesters, because existing stop and search powers are used against communities of colour and Black men in particular at staggeringly disproportionate rates. So the fact that they're going to enhance that through this bill is worrying indeed. There is a dangerous connection between that which runs between the Sewell Report, this week's Education Committee report against white privilege, the police crime sentencing and courts bill, and many other initiatives taken by this government. They all reveal a deeply troubling, broader political project which is designed to divide our communities against each other and really to distract us, to distract the reality of the situation, which is the real causes of inequality and injustice. We know what they are, the government knows what they are, but their actions is set to divide us and distract us. As the radical Angela Davis said, if we don't take seriously the ways in which racism is embedded in structures of institutions, if we assume that there must be an identifiable racist who is the perpetrator, then we won't ever succeed in eradicating racism. Now is the time for us to integrate our systems of government so that we can end the global scourge of racism, no matter what form it takes. So yes, bring on the revolution, bring on solidarity. Let's continue to build a movement against these atrocious policies and actions by this government. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. So thank you also to all the panelists who've spoken. Thank you to Priya, and thank you to Dion, and thank you to Councillor Elaine Pantling. And thank you also to all of you for attending and for staying till the end. it would also be absolutely brilliant if you could follow our speakers on Facebook and Twitter. Claudia is doing some amazing work. If you follow her on Facebook and Twitter, you will see some of it. Same with Priya and the Highfields Center, and Dion and the Race Equality Center. If you're on social media, please follow them, and also follow the work that Civic Leicester is doing on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, where this video from this event will go. We will stop here, and then we will have the second part of this conversation, where we look at another aspect of the Sewell Report with another set of speakers, ideally next month. And we'll keep doing that until we cover the whole report, and we get to hear, we try and get a more nuanced sense of what is happening, what the report is saying, and also what it means for Leicester and how people in this city should or ought to respond. Why does Leicester's response matter? Leicester's response matters because Leicester is possibly the first plural city in Europe where there is not one group that forms more than 51% of the population. And yet, at the same time, we also find that Leicester is a challenge area in the sense that there are inequalities. The inequalities that are in this city are racialized. So things that this report says also speak to what is happening here. And we have a potential that through these conversations, we can also get to build a city that works for everyone who lives here and works here. So once more, thank you all very much. And we will see you hopefully at the next event. Thank you. And have a brilliant rest of the morning.